Now before we begin, I want to be very clear. The world we're describing today is a complete dystopia. There are a few timelines that I can imagine which would be worse for humanity. Anyone wishing for an Axis victory in World War II or derive any pleasure from this scenario are simply horrible. There are many great conflicts in history, but there is no debate to be had regarding World War II. The men and ideologies driving the Axis powers were amongst the vilest the world has ever seen. Any argument you might levy against the West for their conduct in World War II, they pale in comparison to the documented actions and plans the Axis had during the war. This video does not mean to condone these actions, and it especially doesn't wish for them. It is simply meant to educate people on the horrors of World War II. The way this video aims to do that is by painting an absolutely best case, mostly realistic scenario for the Axis during World War II. I do this for a simple reason. It seems that a lot of people think that World War II was a close war, that victory in a single battle, the fall of a single city, or the actions of a single man were the difference between our timeline and one with some form of Axis victory. This just isn't the case. In nearly every field, Germany is hopelessly outcompeted by the Allies. Meanwhile, Japan failed to subdue China and don't expect them to win any long-term war with America. So my goal here today is to broaden the conversation around true Axis victory scenario. Hopefully, bringing some nuance to ideas like Dunkirk fails, Lord Halifax surrenders to Germany, and how Germany can run rampant in Europe unopposed. Or, if Germany only bombs British airfields, they win. Or, a Republican interventionist wins in 1940, so Germany wins. Or, Stalingrad falls, so Germany wins. That being said, while the individual changes within this video are mostly realistic, them all coinciding to allow a devastating Axis victory obviously is not. This scenario will try to not delve into fantasy like scenarios like Man in the High Castle, but also try to deliver an as complete Axis victory as possible. This video was also made in collaboration with LoreDad. More about him towards the end of this video, but he has today released 2 videos of his own, focusing on a more traditional Axis victory, putting greater emphasis on the conclusion of the conflict, exploring the ramifications of it in a potential alternate Cold War. So, actually starting our scenario, we go all the way back to the Russian Civil War. There are generally 2 ways to keep Russia as weak as possible. The first is for the White armies to win the Civil War. Don't get me wrong, I am not a fan of the Bolsheviks, but the ragtag group of unorganized generals, all with different ideas for the future of the nation, at best ends up with a democracy that tears itself apart due to internal disagreement and the Great Recession, or at best with some pseudo-Tsar consolidating power. Neither are likely to radically reform Russia into an industrial powerhouse within a generation. Alternatively, and perhaps more easily, the Bolsheviks can still win the Civil War, but we remove Stalin from power. Most realistically, by Lenin's testament coming out, a piece of paper in which Lenin denounces Stalin right before his death, a paper Stalin had hidden in our timeline. Have this paper get out, and Stalin's political career is doomed. You may think, so now Trotsky takes over, perhaps getting the Soviets into a war with the entire world, but no. First of all, because Trotsky, while being a proponent of the idea of a global communist revolution, still had common sense, and wouldn't just risk it all on an immediate war with the West. But, perhaps more importantly, because Trotsky wasn't actually a candidate to rule the Soviet Union. Most Bolsheviks didn't really like the man, and he would greatly struggle in finding a coalition to rule with. Most possibly, nobody takes up quite the same position of power as Stalin, but rather a coalition of men might, possibly led by this man, Nikolai Bukharin. Bukharin and his allies prefer to focus the Union on agriculture, something the Russians were traditionally better at, rather than switching to a heavy industrial focus. While the lack of Stalin is something to be celebrated, the Soviet Union would fundamentally be weaker in terms of heavy industry. Now, between these two options presented, I am going to go with the second one. Mainly because a white army victory requires far greater changes than an ideological switch within the Soviet Union. Besides, a white army victory likely comes with major ripple effects we'd better avoid. Obviously, the lack of Stalin affects a lot already, but at least there is still a Soviet for the Germans to rally against. Eastern Europe can still be threatened by the communists, and diplomacy on the whole might be a lot more similar. We could also go even further by having the Poles win the Russo-Polish War. But again, this is generally excessive and will also have massive ripple effects. But keep in mind that across this scenario, we are dealing with a fundamentally weaker Soviet Union. With that, we move to 1932, specifically 1932 in the United States. Up to this point, history has mostly progressed the same way. Great Depression, a change of leadership in Germany, and the rise of the military in Japan. But a change is due in America. A major under-discussed element of World War II was the sheer uniqueness of Roosevelt. Not just because he was the first person to win a third and even a fourth term in office, but for something much more subtle. For being a huge fan of the British, who were traditionally a rival of the Americans, and being a proponent of interventionism in a traditionally isolationist nation. Not every president would have pushed as hard to start Lend-Lease. Most US presidents would not have joined the Atlantic War. Most US presidents would not have sought to join the war in Europe this fast. Removing Roosevelt would be a major blow to the Allies. Now, we also don't need to exchange him for a staunch Republican isolationist. Considering the Democrats' electoral dominance in this era, this would be tough. But even most Democrat figures wouldn't have done the same as Roosevelt. Replace Roosevelt with a figure like Al Smith in 1932, and we already have a far less proactive president in foreign policy. Perhaps a realistic way to remove FDR is for controversy to rise in 1940 about his potential third run as president. Initially, Roosevelt did indeed plan to not run, but after the fall of France, he considered that only he had the experience to steer America through the troubles of the time. But perhaps, if he is just a little bit more ill already, he might be convinced to respect the two-term convention set by Washington. A problem here is the 1940 Republican was Wendell Willkie, a man specifically chosen by the Republicans because he was in favor of American support to the British. He wouldn't quite be as forceful as Roosevelt, but he did get on board with Lend-Lease and full American participation after Pearl Harbor. The other Republican candidates, like Robert Taft and the more well-known Thomas Dewey, were far more isolationist, but there is a reason that they weren't chosen. While few were in favor of participation in the war, most Americans in 1940 did support the idea of aiding Britain materially. Any 1940 victory for the Republicans is difficult due to the sheer popularity that Roosevelt, and thus the Democrats, enjoyed. And especially a true isolationist probably won't ever win this election. For any such timeline, we'd probably need the New Deal to be considered a disaster, allowing the Republicans to capitalize on this. So, as you may notice, the specifics are difficult to fill in, but the point should be clear. Replace Roosevelt with a less strong and unique Democrat, feeding into any of the candidates mentioned, even if not a full isolationist, and we will greatly diminish the unconditional aid to Britain, delay American participation in the Atlantic War, and most certainly delay America's direct intervention in the European War, all greatly increasing Germany's shot at victory. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. Keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. But how do we improve Japan's odds of victory? Arguably, their chances are even worse than the Germans. Even just conquering China, short term, proved a task too big for Japan, held back by staunch resistance and the sheer number on the Chinese end. But especially after committing to a war with the West, the odds of coming out on top grew to near zero. America was simply too strong for Japan to ever contest. Even the more isolationist-leaning presidents were mostly isolationist in regards to Europe, a continent they weren't directly involved in, while the land-based Germany posed little threat to the United States. Japan was different, holding some very explicitly anti-American ideals, as America can't just accept Japan coming over to dominate the Pacific. America, long-term, just standing by as Japan rolls over Southeast Asia is difficult to imagine. So, how to improve Japanese odds at winning the war? Simple. You remove the war. For the past few decades, Japan and China had a very clear pattern, with Japan consistently pressuring whatever regime remains in China. And, for the most part, China would find itself forced to accept every Japanese demand, realizing they were not in a position to win a war against the Japanese. This led to the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek to formulate a pretty clear policy towards the Japanese, where first they tried to reconsolidate China as much as possible, gathering the strength necessary to confront Japan later. A more extreme version of this policy sought to, in the short term, align even closer to Japan, in order to learn from the Japanese and industrialize, and essentially copy the strategy used by Japan against the West. Wang Jingwei was the figure that embodied this ideal the most, hoping to go all in on the appease Japan strategy, using their help to reconsolidate the nation. But a big asterisk must be placed here. He did not intend to become a full Japanese puppet. He was a proud Chinese nationalist. He simply considered cooperation with Japan the best route in the short term, further bolstered by an equal hate to the white powers, which would have to be the alternative to cooperation with Japan. Wang would go so far in this that when he considered the war unwinnable in our timeline, he accepted the position as president of Japan's puppet regime, even now still believing that collaboration was the better course to long-term Chinese success. But with such obviously dangerous ideals, he was kept far away from political power in China, right? Well, not quite. He had held the position of Prime Minister of the nation and was one of the main opposition figures to Chiang Kai-shek, and arguably one heartbeat away from ruling China. For this, we look to the Xi'an incident. Basically, the communists were annoyed that China still cared more about them than the obvious Japanese threat. So the nationalist Northwest Army captured Chiang upon a visit, forcing him to reach a deal with the communists to pause the civil war and take a harsh stance against the Japanese. It is often considered that this incident in 1936 was a main motivator behind the Japanese invasion a year later. But things could have turned out very differently. Radical elements on the communist side preferred to assassinate Chiang, while some on the nationalist side, Wang Jingwei included, preferred not to negotiate but to militarily respond to the situation. This, of course, would almost certainly guarantee Chiang's death. Due to the intervention of figures like Chiang's wife, which saw Wang's plan for what it was, a power grab, the issue was resolved diplomatically. But what if he was successful? The Chinese Civil War again escalates, and Wang Jingwei attempts to place himself at the helm of the Chinese Republic. Now again, what doesn't happen is Wang immediately and blindly surrendering China to Japan's desires. China remains completely independent. What does change, however, is that Japan has no reason to go towards a full war, rather continuing the policy that they had pursued for the past few years. Most will know about the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, but few know that this wasn't the end of the Japanese pressure. They then forced Shanghai to be demilitarized, created a puppet regime in Inner Mongolia, expanded Manchuria, created a puppet regime in East Hebei, and demilitarized northern China. The nationalists would sign treaties legitimizing these Japanese gains. From the perspective of Japan, they are successfully, albeit slowly, consolidating control over northern China. Only after the Xi'an incident, with Chiang now taking a hardline stance towards Japan, did they commit to a full-scale invasion. What we can expect now is a continuation of pre-war politics between the two powers. As China refocuses on the communists, the Japanese will simply continue to slowly increase their control over northern China, as well as the Chinese economy at large. This is, truly, the best that Japan could hope for. Not only did they not have to fight a war, they also avoid the resistance in occupied territories. Of course, Wang's popularity in China will quickly deteriorate, weakening his rule over time. But even this could be good for Japan. As Wang's rule over China stumbles, this will only push him further into Japan's sphere of influence. Now, Japan is also free to pursue alternate conflict, either a push into the European colonies or into the Soviet Union. Here, we remember that we set up for a weaker Soviets overall, and with Japan not involved in a land war in China, they might commit harder and win the border conflicts against the Soviets, thus planning for a war in Siberia. That leads us, finally, to Europe. For the most part, we will simply follow our own history. After all, what could possibly go better for Germany? There is a bit of a side note, as the alternate Soviet leadership could have butterflied away the lead up to World War II. Still, the same dynamics are mostly in play as in our timeline. Stalin too had initially wanted to confront Germany over the Sudetenland, but the West didn't, as they preferred appeasement, and Poland and Romania wouldn't let Soviet forces through out of fear that they might never leave. This is still the case here, and thus the fall of Czechoslovakia is still likely, and an alternate Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact could be too. Thus, Poland is still partitioned, Norway is invaded, and the invasion of France is a surprise victory for Germany. Britain now stands alone against the Germans. You might expect me to now say, and Dunkirk is a total disaster, Lord Halifax takes over the government, and Britain agrees to surrender to the Germans, solidifying their control over Europe. But I won't. This is for a number of reasons. First, many misunderstand Lord Halifax's position. He did not wish to simply surrender to the Germans. He simply wanted to open up negotiations. He had even hoped that Germany might be persuaded to leave much of Western Europe, something they'd obviously never do. Don't expect Lord Halifax in 1940 to simply agree to hand over all of Europe to Germany. The second reason I'm not going with this idea of peace is an often under-discussed fact. Upon peacing out, Britain is still one of the most powerful nations on Earth, with a near fully functioning industry and economy, and they would have plenty of opportunity to use this peace to rebuild their air force and military and stand at the ready to rejoin the conflict later, when Germany starts struggling in Russia. In my opinion, too many seem to think that a peace deal in 1940 would mean Britain giving up on Europe. But they couldn't. That would just be waiting for Germany to consolidate the continent before they invaded Britain again. And the British knew this. Any British peace in 1940 would be akin to the treaties signed with Napoleon, a ploy to buy time, to later contest German hegemony in Europe again. So rather than an immediate peace, I'd focus on the Italian role in the conflict. When they joined the war, they outnumbered the British 5-1 in Africa. But they did little to push this advantage, instead being completely humiliated in not just East Africa, but in Libya too, despite at every turn outnumbering the British. By the time Germany intervened to help the Italians, the British had already solidified their lines, and while Rommel performed very well, he would fail to truly threaten British Egypt. But if we assume the Italians had just been moderately more competent in these early months, not even achieving massive victories, but just successfully holding off the British, while Germany, seeking to get Britain out of the war, sent the Italians some tank divisions earlier, it is far from unthinkable that in this first year of the war, British lines in Egypt could collapse. It cannot be understated how much Italian incompetence messed up this very winnable theater for the Axis. Should such a thing have occurred, we have a major issue for the British. If Egypt truly breaks, British positions become near impossible to hold. At the same time, Iraq had a pro-Axis coup, further complicating the British position. If we really want, we can even get the Vichy French involved through Syria, all in all, causing a collapse in British control over the Middle East. Axis access to oil is now secured, while Britain is seriously feeling the heat of the conflict. This is combined with bombing runs on the British Isles, submarine operations in the Atlantic, and, as a German victory seems more and more likely, either a Spanish entry into the war, securing the Mediterranean for the Axis, or even just a German invasion of the nation, practically achieving the same result. With our changes to America leaving Britain even more isolated, this could be a situation in which Britain could truly surrender to the Germans. Now you may think, what a bunch of pointless extra steps, with only minor changes to just having Lord Halifax peace out in 1940. But again, realize the difference in British power between those two hypotheticals. In most 1940 peace deals, the British Empire is left near intact, therefore absolutely ready to oppose Germany later. An alternate peace, after such an intense humbling, would see Britain's control over the Middle East destroyed, with Germany now having their own oil supply secured. In Europe, crucial choke points to the Mediterranean in Malta, Gibraltar, Tangier, as well as the Suez Canal are all held by the Axis now. Compared to the White Peace often suggested in 1940, Britain is far less likely to, in the short term, recover and confront the Germans again, especially without Roosevelt having their back. This, in my opinion, is the difference in what truly allows for an unconditional German victory, as we set up for the final conflict, Operation Barbarossa. Now, even if we hadn't changed the Soviets, a German victory is already far more likely, as they are unburdened with Britain in the West and little to no foreign aid to the Soviets. But even still, I went through the trouble of specifically weakening the Soviet Union at the start of this video. Why? Well, because Stalin's Russia already performed far better than anyone could have imagined. In the case of a German peace with Britain, the Soviets would prepare their forces far better than in our timeline. And while the Germans are favored to win, it could be a conflict that lasts for years at the least. Again, even in this world, this could provide potential long-term issues, as others might decide to at least indirectly support the Soviets. Weakening the Soviets further gives much more potential for a fast and decisive German victory. Now, in terms of alternate strategy, it doesn't really matter too much, especially as the Japanese would invade from the east too. Still, for the sake of it, if I were to change the operation, I would put just a little bit more emphasis on the push to Moscow. In our own timeline, while the Germans came close, the capture of Moscow wouldn't have broken the Soviets. Why? Because Germany arrived so late that the Soviets would manage to liberate the city in their counteroffensive. The damage to the city and Soviet morale would be immense, but not unrecoverable. But if we change just a little bit, and the Germans do manage to decisively capture and hold the city, now that's a major blow to the Soviets. The loss of the city as a railway hub would cripple Soviet logistics, especially without American Lend-Lease providing trucks to replace it. Following this year-one capture of Moscow, the next focus is obviously the Caucasus. Not necessarily for German oil supplies, they get enough from the Middle East now, but just to deny the Soviets the resource. With Moscow and the Caucasus captured, and no other nations in the war, the Germans have practically guaranteed their victory in the East, and therefore their conquest of Europe. Now, on my channel, I have yet to go into much depth about an Axis victory, but today I think it's important to hammer home just how horrible this timeline would be. Even more so because, when compared to most Axis victories, there really isn't anyone to competently stand up to the horrific regimes that we have allowed to prosper. Here, I will remind you one more time to watch LoreDads' video after this one, as he explores a potential Cold War after a more limited German victory. Now let's take a look at the world that we have created, which is now basically split between three great powers, with first the Americans. After having removed Roosevelt, setting back American interventionism greatly, the speed of Axis victories prevents whoever is president in his stead from positioning the US to get involved. Even more, without Japan striking Pearl Harbor, even in the Pacific, the US has no reason to do anything. Of course, I don't think it's crazy to say that after the fall of the Soviets, even the US will somewhat wake up from their isolationism. In 1939, American isolationism still made sense. Germany wasn't a threat. After the unexpected fall of France, many Americans slowly began realizing the potential of Germany as a threat, but even still, it wasn't too big of a deal. But after Britain had been successfully humiliated and Russia conquered, even the US has to take the threat seriously, especially due to the two-front war potential with Japan. A formal alliance isn't signed, but US-British relations improve, and many expect American intervention if Germany does invade the UK. Especially in the naval department, the late 40s would see the US solidify their position as the naval hegemon, while the US and the UK still easily have the edge in the nuclear program. Where the Soviets had spies capable of stealing the bomb, the Germans and Japanese did not. Especially since America has no war to test the war on, meaning knowledge of the discovery is more restricted, at least on paper, the nuclear umbrella safeguards the free world under America's defense. In practice though, many still raise questions about whether America will actually get involved to defend London. Now the second power block is the European axis. Though a soft split does start to develop on the continent, in practice, Germany is more than strong enough to keep their allies in line. Germany is now free to exact their horrific plans upon Europe. These include the Holocaust, the senseless murder of Jews and many other groups. Some might say, but maybe with Britain piecing out, Germany instead sends the Jews to Madagascar as they had planned. This is true, but this wouldn't have been any better. Madagascar would be a directly SS-controlled state, and the Germans had still expected most to die on the journey, or if not, in the big open-air prison that Madagascar would become. It would 100% still be amongst the greatest crimes against humanity in history, only rivaled by another German plan, Generalplan Ost, Germany's plan for Eastern Europe. This is a well-documented German policy during World War II and plan for after. The former Soviet Union was to be divided into Reichskommissariats, and each region had a certain percentage that had to be removed. On paper, they would only be deported to Siberia. In practice, many were actively being murdered even during the war, and few were expected to survive such a trip. Whoever remained was considered acceptable for Germanization, a process in which your entire culture would be destroyed, and even then, you would be treated as a second-rate citizen as slowly but steadily, true German settlers would flood in to take the land. Even on the lower end of estimates, at least 90 million would be killed by the Germans. For reference, even that low-end estimate is more than the total casualties of World War II in our timeline. This would, without a doubt, be the single worst crime against humanity ever. While I would love to be optimistic and say, but there is no way that Germany could have actually accomplished this plan, I do fear that I would be telling a lie. With the Soviets gone, removing organized resistance, while I am sure that guerrilla conflict would persist, Germany has no trouble responding by flattening entire cities and artificially creating famines. Unless something really radical ends the German regime, I do fear that large parts of this plan could realistically be executed. The rest of Europe would also be reorganized, as Germanic nations, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Belgium would all be expected to fold into the German Empire after a couple of generations of Germanization. Switzerland would be destroyed too, while Vichy France might be restored to the north, but it would not stop being a German puppet, while roughly this strip of territory was to be Germanized too. It is even possible that more radical proposals, like a Burgundian SS state or an independent Brittany, further divide France, all to ensure that they can never again be a threat to the Germans. Whatever supposedly independent states remain in Europe, with the exception of Britain, they are all nothing more than puppets of the Germans. While Germany has some fundamental issues, especially with their economy, their hegemony over Europe is so complete that apart from a nuclear war with the Americans, their rule will at least last for a decade, more than enough for Germany's plans to irreversibly ruin Europe. That leaves Japan, their sphere now extending from Siberia to loose influence over Central Asia and most of China. More than likely, they have also seized Indochina from a weakened France, practically puppeting Thailand too. This already puts massive amounts of Asia under Japanese control. And while Japan must still be careful to not start a direct war with America, they could absolutely get involved in independence movements across Southeast Asia. With the Netherlands permanently controlled by the Germans, it is decently likely that Japan is successful in this in Indonesia. Out of fear of India's independence movement being co-opted by Japan too, India would at least get autonomy as a dominion. The conflict between Britain and Japan over the Asian colonies will be fundamental to the future of Asia. Still, most of Japan's attention will remain aimed at China. There are almost 500 million Chinese, compared to 75 million Japanese. While the Japanese were also horrific, they didn't have the same industrial-scale murder plans as the Germans, and therefore are likely to get stuck for decades in a constant cycle of violence, tearing the Chinese nation apart. So, that is the very depressing conclusion to this video. To anyone who considers this a better world in any way, I have no words for you. Once more, I will redirect you to LoreDads' channel, where he discusses his own potential Axis victory, including the consequence of a potential alternate Cold War.